and we also got a button that could be pressed. But at the moment, of course, nothing happens if you type here or if you press this button. This is ignored. And this is ignored because we're not handling these events. And just as with a web app that you're building with React, you of course need to handle them if you want something to happen. The good news is that you do handle events in the same way you would do it in web apps though. You can add event listeners and connect them to event handler functions, and you can manage state in your components with the useState hook just as you would do it in any other React app. Because this is just a React app, the only difference, as you learned in the first course section, compared to a React app that targets the web, is that we use a different platform. With React Native instead of state that I want to handle, the first one would be a click on this button. But before we handle that, I also want to handle keystrokes on that text input element so that I can grab the value the user entered and so that we can then use this value to finally add a new goal in this list of goals as a next step. And therefore, these are the first two things I want to do. I will add a function that could be called goalInputHandler that is responsible for fetching that user input as the user types. Then I'll add another function, addGoalHandler, which should be fired when this button here is clicked. Now to connect those functions, we use special event listening props that are provided by React Native on its components. For example, to connect goalInputHandler to text input, we can add the special onChange text prop. This is a prop exposed by React Native, which wants a function as a value, a pointer at a function. In my case, I'll point at this goalInputHandler function, so I'll pass that as a value here. And I'll press the auto format shortcut to make this a bit easier to read. Now please note that I don't execute this function here. I don't add parentheses. If you would add parentheses, this function would be executed as soon as this code is parsed and evaluated. And this would be too soon because that would be the case when this user interface is rendered. I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to point at this function so that React can execute it for me whenever this text changes in this input. And that's what will happen if we set it up like this. Now in this goalInputHandler function here, we then receive the entered value automatically. Because keep in mind, it will be React that calls this function because it's React Native that exposes this prop. And therefore React, or to be precise React Native, will also provide us a value as an input, as a parameter to this function, and that will be the entered text. So we get the entered text automatically. And then we could, for example, console log this here, like this. If we save this code and we have the npm start process up and running, we can go back here, update here in my terminal. That's how this works, and this in this function, so we need it when the button is clicked. Now, if you would be building a web app and you had a HTML, this would have clicked my function that would be value entered in this text input in this function. So what we need to do is we need to update it with every keystroke. And state management works just at the state hook from React. So not from React Native, but from React, the core React library itself. And then we can register an entered goal text state. And in case this syntax doesn't tell you anything, definitely have a look at some dedicated React resources, and you should know syntax like this. So now we got this entered goal text state, which initially is an empty string. But with every keystroke in my text input, I will update it and set my entered goal text to the entered text I'm receiving here as a parameter. And therefore now in addGoalHandler, we can access this state and do something with it. And for the moment, I will simply console log my entered goal text state here. Of course, soon we will update a list of goals, which we then output down there. So let's save this and now log here. Updated code. Now we see some other text here. So this is working as intended. The next step now is to make sure that we can manage a list of goals, which we then can also output. Updating state, if your new state depends on the privilege, because my list of goals is also some. For this, I will again add some state here, because my list of goals is also some data that changes dynamically. And as it changes, the UI should be updated, and that's a typical case for using state. And this state will be initialized with an empty array because I want to manage a list of goals, and initially I have no goal. Now I'll give this state a name of course goals, because these are my goals for this course, let's say, and the set course goals updating function. And now in addGoalHandler, instead of logging our entered text to the console, we can call set course goals and update our goals. And in the end, I want to take my existing goals and append a new one. Now, there are various ways of doing that. One way would be to create a new array and use the spread operator, these 3 dots, which is standard JavaScript code, modern JavaScript code, to spread my existing course goals into this new array so that I keep all the existing course goals, and then I add my new goal by adding the entered goal text, let's say, as a new goal. In this case, a goal is simply a string. And then I add my new goal by adding the entered goal text, let's say, as a new goal. In this case, a goal is simply a string. We could do this, but if you followed a good React resource like my course or the official docs, then you know that this is not the best way of updating state if your new state depends on the previous state, which this state here does. If your new state depends on the previous state, a better way of updating is to pass a function to this state updating function, a function which will be called automatically by React to then derive the new state. And this function will automatically receive the existing state by React. So here we could turn this into an arrow function that gets the current course goals as an input, let's say. So as a parameter, and again the value for this parameter will be provided automatically by React when it calls this updating function, or this function that's passed to the updating function to be precise. And now this value, current course goals, can be used inside this arrow function body. And now we do derive this new state in a better way. The other approach would have worked as well, but this is a recommendation. Recommended way, a best practice way of updating your state. So now we're updating this course goal state based on the old course goals by appending a new goal. The next step, of course, is to now output the list of goals here. we have an array of values which we want to output. And in React for the web, we would use the map method, typically, to map our array of data, of strings or objects, into an array of JSX elements, which can then be output in the JSX code returned by this component. And we can do the same thing here. Instead of outputting this dummy text down there, I want to output something dynamic, which we do by adding curly braces, opening and closing. We can now refer to the course goals array and call the map method on it. A standard JavaScript method because we are writing standard JavaScript code here as Now this map method receives a function, as it always does, and here I'll pass in an arrow function, which as an argument, as a parameter, gets the individual values stored in course goals. So my goals here, the single goals I have in this array of goals, this function is called for every item in the array, so every function call receives a single goal. And then as a return value in this arrow function, we return the JSX element that should be rendered for the individual goal. And in this case, I want to output the goal text, so here I will render a text JSX element, and then between the opening and closing tags, I output goal. Since my goals are just strings here in this array, because I just add my enter goal text, which is just the text that was provided, and therefore just a string, I can simply output the goal between those tags like this, because goal will just be a string. And with that, if we save this, and we give this a try here, learn React Native, if I click add goal, this is added. But we also get a warning here. The same will be true. because goal will just be a string. And with that, if we save this and we give this a try here, learn React Native. If I click add goal, this is added. But we all because goal will just be a string. And with that, if we save this and we give this a try here, and we give this a try here, learn React Native. If I click add goal, this is added. But we also get an iPhone here. If I add another goal now, we get a warning that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. And this is actually a warning has nothing to do with React Native. Instead, with React in general, when outputting a list of data, as we're doing it here, every item in that list should receive a key prop, which uniquely identifies the individual list item. Under the hood, this helps React update the list in an efficient way, so to say. I do explain this in greater detail in my React course, but you should always add this key prop to the individual items that you're outputting as part of a list. Now, the value you pass to key can be anything, but it should be something unique that uniquely identifies the concrete value that you're outputting here. In this case, I'm just outputting gold, which are just strings, so I'll take the gold string itself. This is actually not necessarily unique, because I could enter the exact same gold text twice, but it's good enough for now. We'll improve this soon. With this key prop added here, though, now if I add another goal, I don't get the warning again. Of course. Of course, here we don't have to enter the same text all the time. We can also learn different pieces of text, like learn all the details. And as you see, our list keeps on growing here. So with that, we're now able to certainly did many all we want to do. Outputting the data in a list as we're doing it here is nice, but it would also be nice to have some styling on those list items. And therefore that's what I want to do next. Of course, feel free to also pause the video here and practice this on your own. Apply some styling, any styling of your choice, to these individual list items, and then compare your solution to mine to see how I styled this. Now here's what I will do. I will create a new object that keeps or that holds the styles for those list items, and I'll name it goal item. The name It was up to you though, here in this bit, maybe a radius here, so that we have rounded corners. And this also wants a value that's defined as a number. And here I'll set this to 6 pixels. Now to make sure that we can see this radius, I will give this a background color, so that this item has an overall background color of a specific hex code that I prepared ahead of time, which is 5E0ACC, which is a nice purple color. I also want to have some padding in here, so I'll actually add it next to the margin, not because it's required, but to keep those related values together. And I'll add a padding of, let's say, 8 pixels as well, so that we have some inner spacing as well. And last but not least, I also want to add a color here, and I'll set this to white, and this will be the text color. So again, you see, the property names are pretty similar to what you know from CSS. You of course have this camel casing instead of using dashes, because dashes are not supported in JavaScript. But besides that, the names should look familiar. Now we can assign this goal item style to our text items here. So here we can add the style prop and set this equal to styles.goItem. And I'll reformat this to make it a bit easier to read. With that, if we save this updates and we see our items.goItem. And I'll reformat this to make it a bit easier. We see our items here, styling. But actually on iOS, the rounded corners are missing. We only have them on Android. The styling there, the 2 platforms. The idea behind React Native is that you can write code with React that will actually give you native mobile apps for multiple target platforms. So you don't need to write different code to target different platforms, but one and the same code base can get you there. Now this is generally true, but as you will also learn later in the course, sometimes there are differences. And sometimes you need to make tiny code adjustments to target all platforms in the right way. For example, here we got a difference. The rounded corners are missing on iOS because we added our styling here that applies the rounded corners directly on this text component. Now it turns out that this text component is translated by React Native to a fitting native widget, a native UI element. And the element to which it is translated, in case of Android, seems to be an element where corners can be rounded. But in case of iOS, it looks like the underlying native text output element does not support rounded corners. And that's why border radius has no effect on the text elements on iOS. Now to work around that, we can wrap our text here in a view. So in this more generic container element. This is also translated to a fitting underlying element, and it turns out that the underlying element to which view is compiled by React Native is an element that supports rounded corners on both platforms. How do I know that? From the official docs and experience, and I'm explaining it to you in this course so that you don't have to find it out the hard way. So what we can do now is we can grab our style assignment here and add this on this view, and also add the key here on this view, because now the view is the main element that's output here in the list. The text now is a nested element. We still need the text because we still have some text to output, and as you learned before, text must go between text tags. But the styling is now applied to the more versatile view element. If we do that and we save everything, we now see the rounded corners on iOS as well. What we also see though is that the text is no longer white. Now we still have the color white setting here, but this is part of the goal item, which now is actually assigned to this view here, not to the text. And unlike in CSS for the web, the styles don't cascade. That's another important learning here. We do have this CSS-like property language here, if you want to call it like that, these CSS-like property names, but it's not CSS, it never was. So therefore, core CSS characteristics like the cascading white, but and as you learned before, text must go between text tags, but the styling is now applied to the more versatile view element. If we do that and we save everything, we now see the rounded corners on iOS as well. What we also see though is that the text is no longer white. Now we still have the color white setting here, but this is part of the goal item, which now is actually assigned to this view here, not to the text. And unlike in CSS for the web, the styles don't cascade. That's another important learning here. We do have this CSS-like property language here, if you want to call it like that, these CSS-like property names, but it's not CSS, it never was. So therefore, core CSS characteristics, like the cascading nature of CSS, where child elements and descendant elements inherit styles from parent and ancestor elements is not part of React Native's styling approach. We don't have style inheritance here. So if we assign a text color to the view, this does not affect this text, or the text inside these text tags to be precise, because that's a totally standalone element. It is not related to this view. It does not setting the text color style object here, the gold text. With that, we now set our text color here, and now we can add this gold text style to this text here. So we add the style prop and set this equal to styles.goldText. And with this, if we save this now, we now have the white text. Back, and we have the rounded corners. And this is really important. This is something you must understand about styling and about targeting different platforms. The general idea is that you have one code base that targets both platforms. Save this now. We now have the white text and add this gold text style to this text here. So we add the style prop and set this equal to styles.goldText. At the style with this that you have one later in the references can simply be solved like this. So you need to write. It looks like CSS, at least a bit. That's why you really have a global parent element. Just as the rounded corners couldn't be applied to the text, we need to set that on the appropriate text element. And these are these tiny details which you will see over and over again throughout this course and which are super important when you're working with React Native. But with this, we now got the look we want here. And hence, we can now move on and dive a bit deeper into how we can and should output lists like this. So we got our list here. Now, one thing you will notice about this list is that if I add more and more items here, and I just add exclamation marks to make them unique, at some point we will go beyond the available space. Now, you would expect that you simply scroll now, but it turns out you can't scroll. No matter how you try, this is not scrollable. Because by default, the view generated here, this view that holds everything in our app component, is not scrollable. That's also a difference compared to the browser. On a website, if you exceed the available space, by default, scrolling bars will appear and you can scroll the website. This is not the case here in mobile apps. If you want to scroll, you have to explicitly tell React Native and the native platforms. Now, of course, this is a common problem and scenario though, and therefore making lists or content in general scrollable is very easy. There is a dedicated component provided by React Native that helps you. And that's the scroll view. We import scroll view from React Native just as we imported text input button and so on. And scroll view does what the name implies. It gives you a view, so such a container element, which will be scrollable. And therefore we can now use this scroll view around our goals here. So let's try replacing this view here with our scroll view simply. We add scroll view here instead of view around our list of goals. And I leave my style on the scroll view. Keep in mind, this style here controls that this container takes up a lot of our scroll view simply. We add scroll view here instead of view around our list of goals. and I leave my style on the scroll view. Keep in mind. And therefore we can now use this just as we imported text input, that if I add more and more items here, do some on a website if you exceed the available space, by default, scrolling bars will appear and you can scroll the website. This is not the case here in mobile apps. If you want to uniquely identifies the individual. List item way, so to say. I do explain to the interview pass to keep the value that it's good enough for now. Also, I will create a new object that keeps all time so that we have rounded corners, and this also wants a value that's defined as a number, and here I'll set this to 6 pixels. Now, to make sure that we can see this radius, I will give this a background color so that this item has an overall background color of a specific hex code that I propose here. Keep those related values so that we have some inner spacing. And last but not least, I also, so we of course our script. Now we can style prop and set this equal to styles.go. Item. And I'll reformat this to make it a bit easier to read. With that, if we save this updates and we see our items here. What you will see as platforms in the right way, directly on this text component. Now it turns out that deployed C rounded work around generic container element. This is also translated to a fitting underlying element, and the turning on who is the main element. And also add the key here on this here. But now it comes text to output, and as we learned before, what we all have the color is, and unlike in super important language, CSS, when I call it like that, these CSS, so therefore, where we don't have style inheritance here. So if we assign a text color to the view, this does not affect this text, or the text inside these text tags to be present. size, because that's a totally standalone element. It is not related to this view, it does not inherit any styles from that view. So setting the text color on this view does nothing to the text inside that text element. Therefore, what we need to do is add fitting name. We could leave it there, text color here, have any effect, any from go item on the view. We could leave it there, but it doesn't have. So we add the style, we have the rounded corner. With this, if we save this now, we now have the goal text. And with this, if we save this now, we now have the white text back and we have the rounded corners. And this is really important. This is something you must understand about styling and about targeting differently. Platform. Old text. The rounded corner about to write totally like going on. Support it into the text, the internal text here. We need to set that. That on the appropriate text over and over later. But it's super important when you're working with React Native. But with this, we now got the look we can. If you want to, and therefore React Native, just as we imported text input button and so on. And therefore making lists or content in general scrollable is very easy. There is a dedicated component provided by React Native that helps you. And that's the scroll view, text input button and so on. And scroll view will be scrollable. So such a container element which will view around our goals here. So let's try replacing this view here with our scroll view simply. We add scroll view here instead of view around our list of goals. And I leave my style on the scroll view. Keep in mind, this style here controls that this container takes up a lot of space. If we save this, this doesn't look too good. This now is indeed scrollable as you see, but the space is different than it was before. We have way more space for the input and way less space. Job of scroll view. So what you should do here is, which you then apply the style that sets the height that will be taken up by that view. So that is the setup we had before, but now we have a scroll view inside of that view. This area inside that overall space. With the scrollable here. That's of course what interact with the surrounding container. If we set it up like this and we save everything, we get the same. Then make so that is the setup we had before. So what you should do here is add another normal view, which restricts the available height, to which you then apply the style that sets the height that will be taken up by that view. So that is the setup we had before, but now we have a scroll view inside of that view. So the outer view controls how much space this area of the screen should take up, and the inner scroll view then makes sure that this space and the items in that space, to be precise, will be scrollable inside that overall space. That's how we set up such a scroll view and how we let it interact with the surrounding container. If we set it up like this and we save everything, so for improving for this, we can go to our JSX code, because you learned that for these built-in codes, which I think look quite nice, and for adding an item, this is how the buttons look like, and it looks lighter purple. But anyways, you can of course choose it and pop change a little bit though and change it to 16. But of course, this comes down by Expo. So if I now reload after adding this to app.json and saving that file, matter, but this can be the more convenient approach if you do have multiple screens. Of course, like this, I'm not totally happy with the way this add new goal button looks. I think it's a bit hard to see on iOS. Therefore, what I will do is in app.js, I will change the color of this button, and we could go for a lighter purple. Styling change, we have a dark background. Now it is the status bar. Light. And if I do that, this app is finished now. Definitely feel free to dive deeper into it and tweak it and play around with it. It's time to dive deeper, and that's exactly what we'll do in this course section. We're going to dig deeper into all these to build a complete demo app, a brand new app, a little between 1 and 99, and then it's the phone's task to guess your number, and you give the phone hints, and then we'll see how many turns it takes the phone to guess your number. And as you can already going to dive into many new core components. It's a real built custom components, and we will ensure in the sections before, we already had multiple. Navigation between actually made a lot of sense, but in many apps, approaches and concepts, all of that by building multiple small dummy apps. Have such a meals app where users will be able to choose a category of meals they're interested in, and then they will be able to this course, we're not going to other people in the world, but adding icon as well as for a pure React write-in.
is changing the game for app development. Firebase is here to help. Firebase
दोस्तों कैसे हो आप डेमो करता हूँ तो इसी बटन के नीचे एक शो रिवार्डेड ऐड का भी है जो मैं इस पे क्लिक करता हूँ तो मैं पे रिवार्डेड ऐड कि ऐसे सबसे पहले अगर आपने अभी तक एक ऐड यहाँ पे ऐप्स है इस ऐप्स में जब जाओगे आप तो जब ठीक है यहाँ जैसे यहाँ पे ओपन करना है फ्लावर में से दोबारा से वहाँ से जाके हमें कुछ कोड का यूज़ करना है जो हमें चाहिए होगा ठीक है हर बार क्लिक पे अगर ऐड रन होने लग जाए तो जितने भी लोग ऐप डालते हैं मार्केट में प्ले स्टोर वगैरह पे तो हर क्लिक पे यूजर को ऐड दिखाने वाले हैं तो कैसे चलेगा तो एक बार ऐप जब क्लोज करोगे दोबारा से ऐप शुरू करोगे उस केस में फिर से ऐड तो ये देखो हम जैसे और ऐड इवेंट टाइप ठीक है ये हो गया हमारा टेक्स्ट ऐड के लिए अब हमें क्या करना है इस बटन की बस यहाँ पे देखो शो करते हैं तो यहाँ देखो हमारा इंडस्ट्रियल ऐड रेडी है
So how do you publish? So which other setting will probably need about environment variables and secrets? Now, environment variables are simply global variables which are set at the point of time of building your app or maybe even already during development, and then you might need them in different parts as part of the code variables and secrets. Here about environment variables and secrets where you learn about different ways because we don't need it here, but chances are that you do have an application that needs
चक्कर में मैंने बार-बार क्लिक कर करके यूज़र को दिखाया और वो सारे लैप्स हो गए, मतलब जितना भी हमने कमाया वो सारा चला गया, ठीक है। लास्ट में होता है ऐसा, तो कम से कम ऐड दिखाएं और प्रॉपर तरीके से दिखाएं, ठीक है। तो वीडियो अगर अच्छा लगा, हेल्पफुल लगा,
it, and then it's important to know that you got a solution built into Expo and EAS in the official documentation. Now with that, we're almost done, and this is a typo. This should be my recipe book here, of course. So with that, we're almost done, but now I want to different my own icons and splash, definitely build more beautiful assets and splash screens. And with that, we now got all the configuration we need for the moment. We got our own icons and splash screens. We are now ready to start the build process with. So let's now count. For example, and for the here in our eas.json file from the other apps. And this identifier could have been set by us before in the app JSON store. And this is required. Can down build deep. I will download this file, and this downloads an APK file, which is this app that was built. And once this is installed, we can start our app from there. Now you can always tweak, of course, the icon and so on if you don't like the look, but this now gives you the app here on the emulator, and this is now the standalone app that we built with the EAS build service. Now here, store. There you instead want to use the AAB in the official documentation. As a side note, if you do want to submit your build files to the stores, course only works on a device where you have an
promises and async await, and also ES6 features like arrow functions and structuring and spread panel. The second thing is TypeScript. TypeScript is not mandatory, but it's highly recommended because it has a lot. In this lesson, we're gonna create our app header of our app. So here inside. Yes. And inside it, we're going to export this. Equals to Android. That's what I'm planning to do until now. So if we need assets, we've just import. Now let's press save. Look, here is the original. Let's just console.log, type hi. Let's make and remove this all screen. Remember this temporary solution that we've done here. Generate me. Then he is generating the text. Now it's task time.
mobile app from scratch for this course. I'm Ellie Altman. I have blogging to share from the beginning, from the user authentication till the end, from to prayer stack and tab navigation. We're going to and also hello and welcome to my course. In this course, we're going for new projects, get new, and also with product. And here else, we will learn how pop up to ask to call. Definitely really confident that now confusion, and we can see now it's a simple arrow function, which is just an alternative way of the separate index that property for scroll view. We can give it a function, let's say do something, so that log, and we do, let's say hello. So it is saying hello. We can write logic, and I will post this in the description of this course of this video. So go
iOS simulation. So we got our scrollable list here, and this is implemented with this scroll view. Now this solution has one downside, one disadvantage though. Scroll view is great if you want to add scrolling around some content. For example, if you had an article which would be too long to fit on a screen,
why build dashboards the old way? Just type your prompt, mockup.ai does the rest. Want changes? Just
ब्रो मैं डिसीजन नहीं ले पाता, हमेशा कंफ्यूज रहता हूँ, फ्यूचर को लेके एंजाइटी भी होती है. एनी सॉल्यूशंस? या व्हेन यू डोंट हैव टाइम टू थिंक एंड यू जस्ट कीप ऑन वर्किंग, तो तुम इतने कंफ्यूज नहीं रहते हो लाइफ में. तुम कंफ्यूज कब होते हो? जब तुम वेले बैठते रहते हो, सोचते रहते हो सिर्फ कि ये कर सकता हूँ, वो कर सकता हूँ, एंड यू डू नथिंग. तुम कुछ नहीं करते हो. दैट्स द प्रॉब्लम. जस्ट बैठो, चीज़ें लिखो और करने लग जाओ. क्या होगा ज़्यादा? कुछ गलत हो जाएगा, बट एटलीस्ट एक स्टेप ऊपर तो जाओगे. अब मैं रस्ट कर रहा था इतने दिन से, 2 महीने लगा दिए मैंने. अगर मैं सोचता ही रहता तो 0 पे होता आज, बट 2 महीने लगाए एंड आई रियलाइज कि डॉक्यूमेंटेशन बहुत लेंदी है. आई वॉज एबल टू फाइंड सम वीडियोज़ एंड आई स्टार्टेड डूइंग इट नाउ. अब 1 हफ्ते में ख़त्म कर दूंगा उसको. वो 2 महीने मैंने वेस्ट किए पढ़ के, लेकिन इट्स नॉट वेस्ट, इट्स सम ग्रोथ. अगर तुम सोचते रह जाओगे तो तुम सोचते रह जाओगे, यू वॉन्ट डू एनीथिंग. फ्यूचर को लेकर एंजाइटी होती है क्योंकि तुम बहुत सोचते हो, बहुत ज़्यादा सोचते हो, तुम करते कम हो. जब तुम बैठ के सोचते हो ना, तुम्हारे दिमाग पे प्रेशर आता है फालतू का. सो वो प्रेशर जो है वो हटा के तुम काम करना शुरू कर दो, और रात को सोने से पहले देखना तुम्हें कितना रिलैक्स फील होगा. यू विल बी लाइक, ओ वाओ, आज मैंने काम किया फाइनली कुछ, मैं सोचता नहीं रहा बैठ के. लेकिन जब तुम सिर्फ सोचते रहते हो, एट लास्ट एंड ऑफ द डे तुम फिर सोचते रहते हो कि यार क्या करना चाहिए, मुझे समझ नहीं आ रहा, क्योंकि तुम कर नहीं रहे हो कुछ भी. वेन यू डू, यू लर्न, यू डू बेटर नेक्स्ट टाइम. वेन यू थिंक, you just think. You don't understand that thing. Seriously. जब तुम्हें पता चलेगा ना भाई, पूरा दिन मेहनत कर लो, एक बार 6 महीने 1 साल के लिए चीज करके देखो, ठीक है. बट बीच में एक आधा जो होता है confused guy, so let's clear out that. So I read one comment कि भाई ये पहले ठीक था, अब इसमें attitude आ गया, ego आ गया, ऐसा कुछ था. नो लाइट नहीं, आज तो है लाइट, बट मैं लैपटॉप पे शिफ्ट हो गया हूँ. कल मेरे को मौका मिला था ना इस पे ट्राई करने का, मिला और मैंने लैपटॉप पे शिफ्ट हो गया. सो आई रेड अ कमेंट कि पहले ठीक था, अभी इसमें एटीट्यूड आ गया, ईगो आ गया. देखो, आई टेल यू वेरी क्लियरली, द थिंग इज कि, और उसको क्यों लगा ऐसा कि इसमें एटीट्यूड आ गया, ईगो आ गया, क्योंकि इन दैट वीडियो आई वाज गिविंग एडवाइस कि स्टॉप वेस्टिंग योर टाइम एंड स्टार्ट वर्किंग हार्ड, स्टॉप बिलीविंग दिस वर्क लाइफ बैलेंस, एंड डोंट go for all these enjoyments. ये पार्टी हो गया, अल्कोहल, डांस करना,
And welcome to Overreacted. Today we are going to build a React Native quiz application, a very big get here, and here 4 options will be any random quick. I'll add a folder called screens. Okay, so it's refreshing, let's wait for a bit. React Native. So for width we'll also give a width of 300. See, the image is here. We'll just center it, text plain vertically, so that we'll do that. Just copy this container and remove this. All those dependent as screens, basic screens. Just now we get it. Okay, so this should not be enclosed in a view. As you can see, this thing, this is my home screen. I am getting a header. This looks very dirty. We can remove. This is the code. They should understand data from API. We are going to use fetch API. Fetch is basically a part till this is JSONified. JSON restart count. So this is an operator. This style. Okay, I got it. So we don't have parent height of 100%. Okay, this is really good.
In this video, we're gonna build a full stack mobile application that works on your actual, let's say, create an Express app. Any tables looks like we got. This is called as. Okay, so this is where we left. started. So to get started, we will see this in action in the next couple of minutes. And then finally, I have some form examples. Just install a simulator. I'll go ahead, maybe just duplicate it. Let's say this is going to screen. So we are bits of data on user's device. So you can think of it as the mobile application state. Then one more thing that I'd like is going to be an ID of to-dos. So that's the argument that we're going to accept, and on top of it, gradient method. And then we would like to keep track of this state. So whatever user types next section, but we are going to implement it in the incoming section and pass the fields. So we'll say ID will be editing ID, and the text, let's say, is auto sync component as well. We'll say preference.
Now it's task time.
So we got our scrollable list here, and this is implemented with this scroll view. Now this solution has one downside, one disadvantage though. Scroll view is great if you want to add scrolling around some content. For example, if you had an article which would be too long to fit on a screen, or you simply don't know which device sizes your users will be using and you want to make sure that an article, for example, is scrollable, in such situations, scroll view is perfect. For lists as we have it here, it's not perfect though. The reason for that is that lists like this could become very long. Sure, you might only have like 10 or 20 items on there, and especially for such a goal list, it's very likely that you have around that size or around that amount of items. But you could also have lists with hundreds or thousands of items. Now, what scroll view does is it always renders all the items that are inside of it whenever the overall UI is rendered. So even if an item is not currently on the screen, like this last list item here, this item is still rendered behind the scenes, even though it's not visible yet. Because scroll view renders all its child items, no matter if we're talking about 10, 20, or 10,000 items. And for very long lists, this can become a performance issue. If you have a long list with dozens or hundreds or thousands of items, rendering them all at the beginning, even though the vast majority is not even visible to the user, will slow down the app, and of course that's not something we want. Therefore, scroll view is great for limited amounts of content, like an article which has a fixed end at some point. But for dynamic lists, which could become super long, we typically don't want to use scroll view. We can, but we typically don't want to avoid possible performance issues. A better solution for such scenarios is another built-in component that ships with React Native, the flat list component. This is another component that will help with scrolling, but as the name suggests, it's specifically built for scrollable lists, and internally, it will only render the items that are actually visible, and all the items that are off screen will only be loaded and rendered lazily as they are needed because the user is scrolling. Now, internally, Flatlist will have a small threshold to make sure it already starts loading and rendering items before they are visible, but it will only render them as the user gets closer to them as he or she is scrolling the list. If you have 1,000 items in your list, the vast majority of items will not be loaded and will not be rendered when using Flatlist. So how do we use Flatlist then? Well, you do use it by replacing scroll view with it. So we replace scroll view with Flatlist. Now, regarding this always bounce vertical prop here, this is still supported. So you can leave it there because Flatlist actually supports pretty much all of the props scroll view supports. Because internally it kind of has a similar implementation, but with this optimization of only loading data when it's needed. So this is a first step, but we're not finished yet. We replace scroll view with Flatlist. The next step is that we get rid of our custom mapping code here. We remove that. We no longer map our data manually. Instead, we now have to pass this task to Flatlist so that it can render this list efficiently by only rendering what's needed. Flatlist is now in charge of this, we need to let flatlist do that. Prop. That's the data that should points at the data that should be output in this list. In our example here, that would be the course goals array. That's the data that should be output as a list, so we pass this as the data should be opening and closing. Cut this, and we can turn flatlist into a self-closing component, and we add render value, a function that will take automatically. Flatlist will pass whatever item should be made defined here. Now, of course, we want to output our item data, and we receive this item parameter value automatically by flatlist. But this item which we get here is actually an object generated by flatlist internally. An object that is just and this of the different item property. Because we're no, and now I will realize it shows up, and I can add multiple items here. And if I add enough items to exceed this screen height, so if I add more and more items here, you will see that this list also is scrollable. I can scroll here. But you also see, of course, that I'm getting a warning. I did get it right from the start, actually. And the warning is in the end that I'm missing some keys here. Because it's still a list, and therefore we still should add keys, but we don't add them as we added them before. Instead, when using flatlist, there are two main ways of adding keys to these list items. The first approach is to turn your data values from primitive values like strings, as we have it here, into objects that have a key property. And that's what I'll do here. When I add a new course goal, instead of just adding the entered text like this as a goal, so as a plain string, I will wrap that to a unique key text property and with a key property. Many as I want, and I don't get this warning anymore, and I got this scrollable list, and under the hood, only the items that are needed are being rendered, and the other items will be loaded lazily as we scroll closer to them. That's how this flatlist works now. Now, if you don't have a property name key, because you're maybe getting data from an API and you can't influence its shape, and you don't want to transform it just because flatlist needs that key property, you also got an alternative to setting up such a key property in the input data. Let's say this would be named ID. This would be a reasonable property name, because this could be a unique ID, but it would be the wrong name, because this list is not looking for an ID property, but for a key property. Now, of course, we could transform it, but if you don't want to do that, you can go to your flatlist, and you can add another prop to the flatlist component. And that would be the key extractor prop. The key extractor prop wants a function as a value, for example, an inline arrow function, but you could also define a function somewhere else and pass a pointer at it here. And this is a function which will automatically receive two parameter values, item and index. These two values will be, on the other hand, how it gets to on Android, if you want to see it there. I can add multiple goals there as well, and there it's also scrollable. So that's flatlist in action, and you should use flatlist whenever you have lists with dynamic data that should be scrollable, and especially if you have lists that could be super long, then for performance reasons, flatlist is better than scroll view. So by now, we already learned a lot about important React Native components and concepts in general. Our app.js file is getting bigger and bigger, and this is something that happens in most React apps, no matter if you're building for React Native or if you're building for the web. Your components get bigger as you add more functionality. But what you do in such cases is you break up your components and you split them into smaller components. That is a common approach and a common best practice for keeping your code maintainable, and it's no difference here for React Native. Thus far, we're working with one component only, but this, of course, is the exception. The norm is that you do work with multiple components, and we want to do that here as well. For this, I'll add a new folder in my project, which I'll name components, because I want to store my components in there. You don't have to use this name, but it is a common convention, since we will be building and storing components in there. And then I want to add two component files again. Go input.js, because there I plan to store the data input related JSX code and functionality. And go item.js, here I plan to store the actual JSX code and functionality that is related with outputting single items. And of course, you could split this into more components. Now I'll start working on this go item component. In there, I'll add a function, go item, because I'll create a function, go component, and I will export this as a default. So I will build a standard React component anymore, and the code that is responsive to app.js, and return it here in go item. Also, this component file also. I'll store this as go item component file. And then here in this, with that I can reference those properties in my JSX code. So with that, we're creating this component. We still need to take care about this text, but we get our first component. And then app.js, we can now import this component. We can now also get rid of some imports which we don't need anymore, because I'm, for example, not displaying a text component in there, and I'm not using scroll view anymore. But I will now import go item from components, go item. And this works just as it works in a regular React app. We import our components from other files like this. We have a capital starting character, because we plan on using this in JSX, and we want to make it clear to React that this is a custom component, hence we start with a capital character. Now, down here in our JSX code, where I return some markup inside of a render item, I now return my goal item component, so my own component. And this is how we define and use a custom component. And of course, in the end, it's totally the same as we would do it in a React or web project. There isn't really any difference.